Good morning,
Hi,
good
Redeema.
afternoon, and good evening by whatever time zone we'll be releasing this episode. Welcome to Creativity Rules. How are you feeling right now, Ron?
I'm feeling terrific. I'm delighted to be here with you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, Ron. Ron, I was lucky enough and privileged enough to actually witness you in action in one of your workshop where you said the future of services care. And I saw the super crystallized way in which you put your thoughts across. And usually, Ron, the perception associated with a thought leader or an influencer or an author who is touted to be number one person on customer service and uplifting service by the global guru, one may think of someone very pensive, very serious, someone who has all the wisdom of the world with a halo in the background. But the day I attended your workshop, you were everything but that. You were fun, you were jovial, you were filled with levity and edutaining. And that's when I knew you have to come on Creativity Rules. So tell us about your journey, Ron. You're a thought leader in your field, and yet you are this entertaining person when he gets in his zone. So tell us about this journey. We are very curious to know about it.
Ooh, I'm going to give you a hyper speed from then to now.
Yeah.
I grew up in Connecticut in the United States. I'm one of five children in the family. When you've got that many brothers and a sister, you're agitating to get attention. And I learned that I could be smart, I could present, I could be a class clown, get in trouble sometimes. But, generally the idea was to be more out rather than in. I
Hmm.
had a grandmother who taught kindergarten for 40 years. And I really learned under her tutelage just how much you can give to other people and how much you can take care of people because she was doing it with the youngsters for 4 decades. And then I got involved in a sport called Ultimate Frisbee, which is now all over the world. But I was there when the rules were first created. And I was one of those people who took the game out to the world. And I'm in the Ultimate Frisbee Hall of Fame as what's called a Johnny Appleseed for taking it out. The reason I mention it is because the first rule of the game is called the spirit of the game. When the rules were originally invented, there were no referees. In other
Hmm.
words, the players, even though they're competing, they're responsible for the quality of play on the field. And I looked at that. I said, okay, my grandmother taught me to love people, right? The energy of my life was to be expressive and engage with other folks in a way that would make them happy that I was there. The spirit of the game is that that's what we need to take out into the world in all of our engagements. And then back in 1990, I moved to Singapore to help the government improve the quality of service in the whole nation. All the manufacturing went to China, all the back office went to India, and the little country of Singapore had to figure out a way to be more valuable in the world. Well, that
Hmm.
meant the entire adult working population had to start thinking more creatively about who do we serve? What do they want? What do they need? What do they value? If you work in a factory, you don't have to do that. You follow the procedures. You use the checklist step by step. You're done. But in a
Hmm.
world of customers, people are always changing. And so that's what got me into the whole field of service that I've been known for. And now, as the world itself has been changing, the phenomenon of taking good care, whether it's of the customer or the colleague or the community or the ecology or the future, that's really a very close connection between the phenomenon of service and care.
So, Ron, that's like a very fast forward recap of your Avenger like life. Now, I'm curious to know, you said two things. You said you started Frisbee when the rules of the games were still being laid out, and you were deeply inspired by your grandmom, and you got inspired under her tutelage. These dots seem to be connected now. Back then, did you know that I'm going to be in the world of service, I'm going to be in the world of care, or customer care is where I see my future? What were the baby steps that you took in that direction? How did that clarity emerge for you, Ron?
Life actually took me. So I went to an Ivy League college, and after 2 years, I was bored silly. And so I got permission. I got permission to leave that university and go to Europe for 2 years to study. And when I got there, the whole frisbee sport, I'd started the ultimate team at Brown University. And when I got to Europe, it was just beginning. And so I had this ticket to travel. where I could go to any European country. And then later I went to the Soviet Union and to China and to India. And with a simple piece of round plastic, I could go into a park and just like that, I could make friends. I could go out on a beach and for sure that night I'd be invited to a party. And so if I found this sort of, passport to people's enjoyment and engagement. So as my involvement with this whole domain of Frisbee sports and activities, I got really good at running tournaments and being the master of ceremonies for the World Championships and the Rose Bowl. But what really turned me on is when I organized festivals. And a festival is when you try to get as many people from the town to come into the same park at the same time. And they're all going to enjoy watching the dog jump for the Frisbees and watching the experts do the show and watching a little bit of a sport, that's in a demo. But what you really do at a festival is you create these moments to teach so that mothers and daughters and fathers and sons can learn to actually throw and catch and play games with each other. And so that was sort of my more populist foundation. So then when I came to Singapore to help improve the service in the nation, which was a national concern, they had service experts. They had people from certain brands like Disney who knew how to do it as a Mickey Mouse world, but they didn't really have the understanding of how do you engage adults so that they want to learn. And two components that I brought from my background was number one, you got to get them in a good mood. It's a lot easier to teach somebody something if they're having a big smile. And the second is you've got to get them physically involved. It can't just be a cerebral intellectual exercise. You got to couple that. Huh? So Singapore wanted to build what was called a service training boot camp, a residential boot camp to teach people about service. And I said to them, well, what do you mean by a boot camp? And they said, well, we're not really sure. Have you got any ideas? Oh boy, do I have ideas. And I ended up being the master trainer and got deeply involved in the curriculum design. And so it was back in 1990 when the field called service showed up in my life. I was doing it before, but it wasn't called that. And then over the 90s, I taught a lot. I read a lot. Starting in the year 2000, I started writing a lot more, publishing books about the topic. And then, as you know, I spent many, many years traveling all over the world as a keynote speaker, as a consultant, as a leadership workshop conductor. And that gave me further access to travel and different audiences and different cultures. And I just get so much energy from being with other people. That's really, I think, what differentiates me from maybe a more classic professor.
Lovely. And as you were narrating your journey, I could picture myself in one of those Frisbee festivals with a can of beer, enjoying the festival and my beer. Okay.
Just remember to throw the Frisbee, not the beer.
A good one. Ron, I want to know from you, you said, in a more structured way, you've started teaching and demystifying service from the 90s. And 3 decades later, you are still the best-selling author. You're still the #1 guru. You're still really good at what you do. So I'm assuming creativity must be implicit in this journey. So what is that creativity, or what is that creative source that has kept you relevant for 3 decades? Because the way I perceive experts, I think experts become redundant after a while because they get a feeling they know everything. So what has kept you relevant in the last 3 decades?
Yeah, first of all, let's just unpack that negative assessment you just shared about experts become stale. Yeah? That's not true of all experts. Okay. When you put a badge on someone and say that person is an expert, it's a positive assessment of either their skill, their understanding, their ability, their innovation in a particular field. Their ability to practice is usually expertise. Okay. And some people achieve a certain level of expertise, and that is where they stay. For example, you might have somebody who's an outstanding surgeon and they're very good at doing a certain practice, and that's what they're going to do for their professional life, and they don't feel the need to push further, right? Other people will say, well, actually, in my field of surgery, there's always going to be new medical technology. There's always going to be new, and some of those surgeons are going to locate themselves at that edge as innovators, as creators, as experimenters, right? And then you might look at that and say, that's a creative expert. And we need some of those because they then will find out what works and what doesn't, and then cascade it back into their community of practice. So that the surgeon who says, so there's a new technique, teach it to me. It doesn't mean, then they may be an expert, right? But it doesn't mean they have to be the one that came up with it. So let's just differentiate between being an expert and being, if you will, a creative expert. Okay, now I think the question you're asking me is, how have I remained a creative expert? And I want to go back to a couple of words that you used. One was demystify. It implies that it's sort of a mystery and you found a way of talking about it that gives other people access to it.
Absolutely.
And I think that that's a very good term to use. When I entered into the field, for example, of service, one of my first questions was, what does service mean? What's the definition? And at the time, there were very shallow phrases like make people happy, or give people what they want. Or here's a horrible one, serve other people the way you would like to be served. And the reason it's horrible is because it assumes other people are like you. But they're not. They're like them. Right. So I was the one who went into that and I said, okay, we've got to do a better job than this. And I ended up writing the definition. Service is taking action to create value for someone else. And the moment I said that, people at boardrooms and leadership and management and supervisors and frontline, they said, yeah, that makes sense. What do? I take action. What's the purpose of my action? To create value. For who? For my customer or for my colleague. Now, if you take action to create value for yourself, it's called self-service. Okay, that's fine. But now here's the creative part. And by the way, on top of that definition, I built learning tools and culture building blocks and leadership rules. And, that was really another term you used, which was crystallizing, taking all of what was out there and actually bringing it into frameworks and models and forms so that it could be easily taught to other people and used in deep consulting engagements. But to give you an example of the creative edge in this COVID era, in this era of ecological crisis, in this era of existential questioning about what kind of a species are we? And do we need to be so that suicide rates don't keep going up, so the depression rates don't go through the roof, so that we actually create sustainable communities together? Then the phenomenon of care now needs to be addressed. Maybe my definition was not where it needed to be. Maybe it's not service is taking action to create value for someone else. Maybe it really should be service, real service, is taking action to create value for someone you care about. Which then inevitably and immediately raises the question, what do we mean by care? And Redeema, I found myself in another one of those human domains that had not been well defined. So I jumped in because I'm a pretty rigorous intellectual guy, and I'm saying, let's look at the history of care. Where is care studied? Well, there's healthcare. And then you get the philosophers, and they'll debate forever about the meaning of care. I said, no, this is not okay. We've got to have a layman's definition that everyone can actually understand. So I ended up writing it. And that's the creative expert side, right? And my definition is that care is your concern and commitment to someone's future well-being. So if you have children and you say, I care about my kids, you don't just care about that they're safe right now. You care about them and into the next moment, next moment, next moment. Yep. And when people say to me, well, what about the present? I go, yeah, but the present is the past, is the past, is the past. That's part of the nature of being human. So then if you care about someone's future well-being, how do you take good care? Well, then you have to do action. So you can see that service and care are connected this closely. And what holds them together at the heart is the devotion to someone's well-being. And that can be well-being of a community or a country or a sports team even.
I like the heart you made towards the end. Very, very cool. Ron, I want to know from you, you were not always an expert on uplifting service. You were not always an expert on being, on demystifying care, but you were an avid Frisbee player. I want to know from you, when you were starting out in this domain of customer service or care, was there any kind of doubt that was holding you back? Because it takes a tremendous amount of courage to go into uncharted territories. So how did you deal with any self-doubt that emanated, or
Yeah,
anything that was holding you back? Did it happen to you? Did that phenomena happen to you at all?
sure. Sure. Well, let's be honest. There's something called the imposter syndrome, which many people experience, which is, I'm the one up there. I've got the microphone. People are looking and listening to me. Do I really know what I'm talking about? Am I really the right person to be doing this?
Yes.
Am I solid in this? If they ask me a tough question, am I going to know what to say? And I would say that it took at least a couple of decades in the field before I reached the point, and maybe it's only been a few years, where actually anybody could ask me just about any question in
Hmm.
this space of customer experience, customer service, and I may not have the right answer, but I'll
Hmm.
know that I don't. And I'll know what I do know and what I don't know, and so I can actually, share that, if you will. And so I think, over the years, that imposter syndrome has fallen away. And the best way to do that is to be a rigorous student of the domain and a rigorous practitioner in the domain, and respect the heck out of everybody else in the domain, because you could learn something from them or with them. That was one. The other is Redeema. I mean, life has just been blessing me from the beginning.
Hmm.
I grew up in the post-war era, as did you. We're not living in an era of world war. It wasn't that long ago that was actually going on. Okay, we happen to be living in an era of ecological crisis and of viruses running around the world in a way that's our generation's concern to deal with. But one of the other great blessings, aside from grandma, aside from Frisbee, was that when I got invited to Singapore back in 1990, there weren't that many people like me here.
Yes.
Okay, there weren't that many energetic, creative, Caucasian, clear speaking English, energizing people who loved to do things with other people. And I remember, after having been in Singapore for just maybe a month,
Hmm.
one of the key people at Singapore Airlines that I was working with, he actually said to me, "You should think about making your life here in Asia." Like,
Hmm.
what? What? I mean, I just came for a visit. And yet I realized, as the project kept going, just what a nice fit it was.
So, Ron, I want to know from you, between becoming an expert, you were always a novice. So, were there any awkward moments that you had to endure? The foot in the mouth moment, or the moments which didn't exist, but they happened to you, but they were great learning moments, because a lot of people shy away into going into uncharted territories, because there's always this fear that what if we make mistakes? What if we goof up? What if we make a fool
Sure,
of ourselves? Did that happen to
sure.
you?
Well, let me give you an example. I'll just tell you what, of course, comes to mind. Yeah. Um, and you mentioned earlier, my brand, and the title of my book is called Uplifting Service.
Yes.
So I brought that joyful, enthusiastic, you could even say I brought my grandmother's spirit and the Frisbee going up, to the field.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much on purpose. That I want this to be uplifting service to the customer, but also for the service provider, and even to uplift the dignity of being in service
Hmm.
to other people. That's a historical phenomenon that goes from way back, when the words serve and slave were very closely coupled to each other.
Yes.
That's not what we mean today. Now we're saying the service provider is the creator of value.
Yes.
That's an esteem. Okay. Now the mistake, the situation was actually a political one. So I was doing a lot of work with Singapore Airlines. I had designed 38 and conducted 38 different programs for them over the years. Pilots, cabin crew, management members, ground handling staff. I mean, foreign offices, you name it, management leadership program. And there was one particular course that I developed for them about, what do you do when someone complains?
Hmm.
How do you write back in a way that will increase their loyalty? And I named the course Writing Back: Increasing Customer Loyalty Through Effective Written Response. Okay, this is a very customized course. Took 2 days to teach, small groups in a classroom working together. It ended up expanding to many other government agencies and other companies that asked me to conduct it for them.
Sure.
And it was highly effective. In fact, they ended up flying in people from all over the world. They even had pilots taking the course. And pilots don't write back. But the underlying principle made sense. A pilot could even use it on the microphone.
Yes.
Okay. So then a new person came into the position of senior customer affairs, like the new vice president of customer affairs. And under that person was this department that would respond to customer complaints. And I was brought in to meet this new leader, and we were having a conversation. And in that particular political environment at that time, the culture was that you never challenged your seniors. If they said something, you agreed, who agreed, who agreed, who agreed. Now, the consultant is a position from the outside.
Yes.
And you would think that part of the reason for bringing in the consultant is to be provocative.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, of course, I'm a Western version. I'm not Chinese culture raised. So the whole Confucian respect for elders, I can appreciate it, but it isn't native to my body. Okay. So we're in the conversation and he shared something. And I said, that is a fascinating way to think about this. I've tended to think about it another way. And I shared another way of thinking about it. And the whole room turned into an icebox. And I could see everybody else around the table sort of all looking at each other, not looking at me anymore. And you could see the leader kind of going, mm-hmm. And I never worked for Singapore Airlines again. Because in that one controversial contribution, and it wasn't even that controversial, Radiva. It was just another way of looking at something, but it violated the cultural expectations of that particular political environment. Now, it's okay. God bless Singapore Airlines. I praise them to the sky. Every once in a while, someone will introduce me as this is the man who made Singapore Airlines. I say, no way. I was privileged to be able to make a contribution to what was already an outstanding brand, an incredible company, and still is today. It's not like they ever needed Ronn Kaufmann. Ronn Kaufmann had the privilege of working with them. But in that particular moment, I grew up politically and recognizing that the need for a certain kind of sensitivity maybe needs to be even higher than I had at that younger moment. Now, let me share with you by contrast and how it evolves. I'm now more than a decade older than that. And I'm doing work in a very complex environment right now. It has a lot to do with healthcare. And there's a lot of thinking there like we know how this works. And yet they want me to help be provocative. So each time I'm provocative, there's a reaction. There's a response. And you've got to be very thoughtful about when and how far. And but it all starts with what's the commitment. And if I have an authentic commitment to their well-being and their cultural development, and if I care about the people who work there and who are served by that organization, then it's not a matter of who's right. It's a matter of what works.
Ron, you spoke about authentic commitment and you also spoke about that you care for them. How do you make this care, like how do you manifest this care to them? How is authenticity manifested? Because sometimes someone can be rude to the point of being straightforward or harsh, and they say, well, this is my authentic self. I can't change myself for you. And this is what I've practically heard in a lot of.
By the way, what you just said is such a pile of. I mean, seriously, this is my authentic self. I'm just being me. There's a true inner me, my wonderful self. Oh, give me a break. That whole interpretation that each of us is some isolated entity from the social phenomenon of being alive is an example of where Descartes, as a philosopher way back, literally separated humans from the natural phenomenon that we are. The self is a social phenomenon. When somebody says, I can't help being myself, well, grow up. Learn, have more sensitivity, appreciate, or recognize that you're not willing to do so and accept the consequences of that. But don't hide behind some separate, authentic, genuine self.
I like the interpretation. So how do you manifest your authentic self? How do you manifest your care for your clients or for the people around you?
Yeah, so the key is in something I just said. The self is social. In other words, we are part of something, not separate from something. In the world of philosophy, I believe there's been a lot of time consumed chasing the question, what is a human being? It's the wrong question. The question is, what is being human? For example, if I say to you, what is a tree? And you give me a really good answer, you're going to have to talk about the dirt and the rain and the bird that carries the nuts to the area where it falls, where the old tree had decomposed and become the dirt. Then you can answer the question. But really the question is, what is treeing? Within which there's a particular one, let's call that one a tree. But it's within the social space.
Yes.
So when you say, what is a person? I would say my secret weapon is I'm always experiencing myself as something social. So then if I'm in a Zoom call with a team like I was last week, and someone is sharing, or I'm calling on someone to speak next, I'm with their facial features. I'm watching everybody else. I want to be the source of praise for who they are and what they're doing. I didn't say I wouldn't be provocative if it's appropriate. But I ultimately want to leave that experience with them actually feeling either better about themselves or recognizing that there's something about the way in which they're being, which they themselves recognize they want to change.
Could you repeat that part again, Ron, the second part?
Yeah, not every helpful interaction with someone will always leave them, quote, feeling better. There will be times when the lean in to provoke needs to occur at a level of discomfort.
Yes.
Okay, you think about like a gardener in a landscape. Sometimes we'll go up to a tree with a chainsaw and take off a big limb.
Yeah.
Because it will help the tree.
Yes.
So there are times when you're a leader, a coach, a consultant, a trainer, a speaker, an author, someone who's there to help, that you may need to lean in for their well-being. But the source of the willingness to lean in is still a commitment to care about their well-being.
So Ron, this is an interesting aspect. What I'm gauging is that you lean in, or you provide them with triggers or cues which are uncomfortable, which may leave them with some afterthought. Generally, when you have challenged people like that, except for the Singapore Airlines anecdote, how has it played out for you? Are there like reverberations, like people debating, or does it lead to any distasteful interaction?
So I want to go back to some of the words you just used. You said triggers or cues that produce afterthoughts.
Yes.
Okay. And so if you look at that way of using language, what we're implying with that, if we were to use it, is that it's like poke, and then like a trigger, poke, or a cue. See this? And then after there would be a thought.
Yeah.
Okay. And what I want to say is it's a more dynamic dance than that. Like just now, when you laughed, when I pointed to the idea of it being, like a trigger, you were not experiencing that, Redeem, as an afterthought. It was happening in the dialogue that we're having. It's live. It's synchronous. Now, do I want to have the person after the conversation live in a space of expanded possibilities, of deeper reflection, of authentic questioning of something that they may have taken previously as unquestionable? Yes. But I don't call those afterthoughts, like they're things. What's happened is the conversation itself has shifted or evolved in a way, the people in the conversation. A phrase I like to use is that life evolves in conversations.
I like that. Life evolves in conversations. Simple.
True enough, isn't it?
Yeah. Ron, throughout all these years, you've interacted with a lot of people, met with a lot of leaders. In your simple parlance and definition, how would you define creativity? That's my question number one. My question number two is, are there any telltale signs of creative people? Like if you interact with them or if you watch them in action, you can sense that these people are creative.
Okay. So,
What's your thought?
yeah. First of all, I share with you one of my mentors in life, who is still accessible to anyone else who wants to do the exploration, is a gentleman named Buckminster Fuller. Buckminster Fuller, he's passed away now physically, but his work is still quite profound. And he was known as Bucky. And Bucky was the designer, for example, have you seen a geodesic dome? You know those round domes that are actually made up of triangles? Well, he is the inventor of that, and many, many, many other things. And there was when he was very young, his eyesight was horrible, and they didn't know it until he was 4 years old. And at 4 years old, they gave him glasses that were, big, thick glasses. But for the first time, he could experience the world a different way. Okay. And he said that was always a great advantage for him throughout his life, because all he ever needed to do was take off his glasses and he could see the world again as a 4-year-old. So when you ask me, is there a characteristic of creative people? It's people who locate themselves in what's going on, whether it's within a particular field of human practice or more generally in life, in this space of curiosity. Like, oh, look at what's going on. Let me relook. What's happening here? Rather than, I know what's happening. I know what's going on. I'm here to just get something done. And you need both as a human being. If you're going to drive a car, it's not the time to be creative about how does propulsion work. It's the time to drive a car, right? As long as we're still driving them and they're not driving us. Okay. So, in general, people who are open to the world, who are intrigued about the phenomenon of life, who approach different areas with a sense of, I wonder how it got that way. And this is now this is getting more precise to your question. The distinction between creativity, like a style of being, and the idea of an invention, and how that's different from an innovation. So let me tease these apart. Creativity would be, I'm looking at this a different way. I'm open-minded. Let me take this area and see if there's some way in which they overlap. Let me speculate about the possibilities of the future. Let me cut myself loose from the standards and the expectations and the assumptions of the past. Without disrespect for the past, but I'm not going to have that bound my imagination for the future. Okay, that's creativity. Now, if you come up with an idea, like, why don't we try, or has anybody ever, Or what if we actually put this together with this? What's going to happen? Now you're inventing. Okay. But there's a huge difference between an inventor and an innovator. An inventor's job is to come up with the next, give it a try. But it's not an innovation until that is actually being used in the world of practice by other people. So, for example, we are alive right now at a time when electric vehicles are going from an invention to an innovation.
Innovation, yeah.
Absolutely, because the community of practice called "Where do I plug in my car? How long can I drive?" You know, if you own a piece of real estate, are you going to put a gas station on it, or are you going to build an apartment building there with a solar panel on the roof that automatically charges the cars? If you're the government, are you going to build another road, or are you going to build a road that automatically charges cars as they drive along the road? I mean, there's a whole field of practice that's now turned electric vehicles into an innovation in our time. Even though the idea of an electric car as an invention existed decades ago.
So, Ron, in your monologue right now, are you saying that creativity is the basis for invention and subsequently innovation? You need to have those seeds in you?
I would say that you could have players in each of these three areas that may or may not overlap and intersect. So if you get someone like Leonardo da Vinci, or whose biography I'm enjoying right now, or you get someone like Albert Einstein, whose biography I recently finished, or you get someone like Buckminster Fuller, who I commend people to look up on Wikipedia and then go explore. You have people who both had creativity and inventive minds, and then various levels of success as innovators. For example, Bucky is not really super well known as an innovator for all of his inventions, because he had inventions like a 3-wheel car. Right. Like I could just see if you're like, what? Yeah, a 3-wheel car, because imagine how easy it would be to parallel park the car if one wheel was like a bicycle wheel and you could just go. Bloop.
Yeah,
For example,
yeah.
Right. Right. Or he invented home interiors that needed fiberglass to be built, like a bathroom interior where you could wash the whole thing down, but fiberglass had not yet been invented. So he could imagine it, and he could even draw it and propose
Much ahead of its
but
time.
the invention wasn't there yet.
Yeah.
By somebody else, by chemists and polymer specialists, in order for it to become an innovation that we all use today. Extraordinary, huh? So some people will take somebody else's invention and turn it into an innovation. And back and forth between those three that you've identified.
Ron, another commonly heard misnomer that I come across when I talk about creativity to my clients is, and verbatim, it goes like this. Riddhima, you know what? It's easy for you to say to be creative, but we are in a software company. Our roles are defined. Our job is defined. I am supposed to work in a particular way. What creativity I'll do? Or I'm an accountant. I'm just supposed to ensure that everything is up to accounting standards. This is my job. It's a very routine desk job. Freelancers like you can be creative. Entrepreneurs to some extent, but not us. This is not applicable to our field. And then I go,
Okay, let me give you 2 examples. One is in India, there's a company called NIIT, which most Indians know as an education company. But there's also a company called NIIT Technologies, which recently has renamed itself. I don't recall the new name. And they had a situation where they had thousands of developers who thought that their job was to meet the service level agreement. In other words, their job was to provide the promised specifications and didn't see the need or the expectation to do anything beyond that. Okay. The problem with that is that then you're competing as a company with other companies who have tech teams that can do the same thing, and then you end up having to compete on price.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So the leadership of the company, Raji Pawar and Arvind Thakur, the founders, decided they wanted to shift the culture of the company to be more creative. What? So we worked together and came up with something, a very simple phrase that said, new ideas, more value. New ideas, more value. And built an entire culture, successfully, by the way, in which they were saying to people, your job is not just to do what it is we've promised, but we need you to be coming up with new ideas. Now listen carefully, that will be more valuable to the client. In order to do that, you've got to be really clear about what the client values. So then you're not just saying what's in the service level agreement. You'd be thinking, why is that the way the service level agreement written that way? What is it that they care about? What is it that they're afraid of? What is it that they want to achieve? If we see the world from that point of view, then we, as the people who are writing the code, could also think more creatively and say, hey, listen, as long as we're building this, why don't we add 2 more features here, which we could do very easily while we're writing the code, even though the client hasn't asked for it. And then we'll show it to the client, and they may or may not value it, but we'll never know if we don't propose it.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, and by the way, the work we did with Wipro was similar, where they had a culture that was known as being a reactive, low-cost vendor. Reactive, they would wait for the request for a proposal. Low cost, they would compete on price. And they were a vendor like everybody else. And we literally worked with them to change their culture so that they become known as a proactive, value-adding service partner. Whoa, what a shift of thinking. Proactive, that which they did not ask us for. We're making offers now, rather than responding to requests. Value adding. What is it that we know that they want, but what else could we add? And we're going to work like a partner, not just a vendor. Now, you also mentioned accountants. So I give you an example of a finance department we worked with in a government agency in the United States. And their job was to manage contract payments and, budget allocations, etc. But after working with us, they realized actually doing all of that is just, that's the standard. That's normal. That's why you have an accounting department.
Yes.
But they wanted to be seen as better than that. And they wanted to be more. So they came up with a phrase that said, creating value beyond the numbers. And here's 2 examples of what they did with that. They reached out to the people whose numbers they managed on a regular basis. And they were asking, like, what do you do with the numbers? Why do you need these numbers? What challenges do you have associated with the numbers? And they discovered 2 things. Number one, a lot of the people that they would provide those monthly reports to weren't very skilled at actually reading the reports. So the finance department came up with a workshop and went out into the other departments to teach people how to read financial reports. They weren't asked to do that. They proactively initiated that. Second example, these guys had to manage all the contract payments, and they realized that not everybody knew how to negotiate a good contract.
Yeah.
So the accounting department leaned out upstream to these contract initiating departments and said, let us do a workshop for you and show you different contract clauses and consequences. Now, who would see that? The accounting department, because they see all the contracts.
Yeah.
But nobody asked them to design that workshop. So then you have to ask the person who says, hey, I just have a job. I'm just here to do my job. Really, the question is, yeah, but do you have any aspiration of ever being promoted? Do you want to be the one amongst your colleagues who is seen as having high potential? And the way to do that is to bring a different creative orientation to the position that starts with what is the value I'm creating and who am I creating it for? Now that opens the barn door for us to be able to think creatively, engage in different conversations, make offers that nobody asked us to do, which won't always work out. Sometimes you'll have your Singapore Airlines moment like I did and make a mistake.
Okay. Ron, my last question, because I know we're running out of time and you have a commitment too. How can people build and nurture this skill? And I'll tell you where I'm coming from. When I was in my third grade, I was supposed to draw my favorite vacation, like the favorite place, usually the hilly area and the mountains and stuff like that. But the fact of the matter is, I was terrible at drawing and probably the only subject in which I've flunked most often. And I actually, instead of drawing, I wrote my favorite vacation, how it would look like, ideally. Okay. And my art teacher, when she was distributing the mark sheet, she literally mocked me and said that here comes a girl who thought that it's a written examination when it was a drawing art test, and she gets a D. And she just said in a very matter-of-fact way, Ridhima, you're not creative at all. And from third grade, that is 1997, up until my first job, which was 2013, I always fathomed it and held it against me that I'm not creative. And because it used to get reinforced at home also, that for my art assignments, I had to seek help of my brothers, my sisters, and all my cousins around. So I fathomed it for the longest time. So I thought that creativity is equal to art. A lot of people have this thing, creativity is equal to singing and dancing, or creativity is acting, media and entertainment, or creativity is advertisement. So it's localized. But it took me some years to unlearn that is not what creativity is. So whether a person is an accountant, a plumber, a high-paying CEO, or whoever that person is, how they can start the process of building and nurturing this skill in a far more structured way, but easy, baby steps, something which is not that difficult or laborious.
Sure. Yeah, so thank you. Thank you for the question. It's a beautiful one, and I'm glad that you released yourself from the fathoms of years. Yeah. So one of the things that I encourage everyone in any area to do is a historical reconstruction of the field that you're in. So, for example, with you, the field that you're in is this world called creativity. I would start by going back and saying, do you know where that word itself came from? Is it from Latin? Is it from Old German? Is it from Greek? I mean, what? Okay. Then, in which societies was this phenomenon called creativity identified as such? Was it agricultural groups who then found ways to channel water, or was it was different forms of hunting or building lodging? At what point did this phrase creativity start to show up, and where? Maybe it did start by showing up in, if you will, the arts, which is still lingering along today, like your art teacher, who had the absurdity to say you're not creative when, for example, if in mathematics you were very creative, you're not drawing anything. You're using symbols up on the board and you're imagining in your mind and framework that you're Albert Einstein. Nobody's going to say the guy isn't creative. I didn't say he was an artist. By the way, he did play the violin. Most people didn't know that. So you can do a reconstruction of the field. And when you do that all the way up to and including present time, then you realize that present time is only part of a historical evolution that continues into the future. And here you are. You're literally right at the crest of that wave by virtue of the fact that you're alive. So that the past is there. It's embedded in practices. It's embedded in our language. It's embedded in people's assumptions and traditions and their bias and their prejudice and their expectations and their standards and their dreams. But it doesn't mean that the future just needs to be a pure continuation of the past. Oh, how might it be different? And in that locating of oneself, in the question of how might it be different given everything that's going on today, now you've located yourself creatively in your own field.
I really liked the explanation you gave for historical reconstruction of your field, literally extrapolating where it emanated from and at the present moment where we are in that entire journey. I literally loved this concept of historical reconstruction of field.
Then let me add one more piece, because not everybody gets that. Yeah. And it's a big word, but it would be called an ontological reconstruction. What do we mean? Well, what was the human concern that the field itself addressed? So if you take creativity, for example, you might say that that whole world evolved out of people wanting to be able to do things more productively.
Yeah.
Like get more agricultural yield out of the same ground, or
Yes.
travel wider distance with a heavier load using less horsepower. Or protect a city from invaders with a different style of wall and protection. So, what were the human concerns out of which creativity evolved? Now, by the way, the ones I just mentioned were all very productive and, you can measure. But then there was the spiritual side. Why music? Why dance? Why arts? Why fashion? And yet each of those also was an expression of some human concerns.
Yeah.
Then how is that concern continue to evolve, and how is that same concern alive today?
But it all starts from the basic question was what was the human concern which led to this point. I think for me, that's the start point of exploring this question for myself.
Good. Good. And what humans have that's different than all other animals is like when we said, what is being human? Being human is being the kind of being that has concerns. And our concerns are like, you could say, but wait, a dog has concerns, a bear has concerns, a snake has concerns.
Yeah.
Well, they do, but the way they handle the concerns are just more instinctively ingrained in being that kind of being.
Yes.
Human beings have this additional magic of being able to be creative because of the way in which language has allowed us to evolve. Hence, there you sit in front of a bookcase. And here we dialogue with one another using terms that every once in a while you say, I like that word you used, and I say, I like that word you used, because there's depth and meaning in those, which we're using in present time.
Yes. Ron, it suddenly feels that from all the levity and from all the edutainment, this conversation went really profound, simple but profound. Simple but not easy to follow, though. Any culminating message for the audience who will be watching it? And it spans from artists who are from my anchoring world, it spans to corporates, it spans to aspirants who are just starting their career or their corporate journey. Any message for them, Ron?
Yeah. It's a phrase I ended up writing when we were redesigning our website during COVID. And there's a page on the website which people are welcome to go visit. The website is ronkaufman.com, just RONKAUFMAN.com. But if you go there, there's one that up at the top says Meet Ron. And if you click on it, in fact, the picture of me was taken in India.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I'll
And the
check this out.
The quote under the picture says, "A life well lived contributes to the well-being of others." A life well lived contributes to the well-being of others. Now, I didn't say you have to wake up in the morning and only put other people before your own sense of purpose and satisfaction and happiness and fulfillment and everything else. But over the course of your life, a life well lived, like when you come to the end of your life, if you've been contributing to the well-being of others, which can be as an artist, it can be as an inventor, it can be as an accountant, it can be as a mother, it can be as a teacher, it can be as anyone. If you're contributing to their well-being, your own sense of well-being will be exalted. So, for example, that teacher who said to you what she said when you were a little girl wasn't really contributing to your well-being in that moment. Now, let's not criticize her for life. She's a teacher. She's a human being too. She has bad moods.
Yeah.
But that would be my parting piece of encouraging advice for all of us.
Ron, one last question. I promise
Sure.
this should be the last, okay? I want to know from you, you've also been a diver. You've done more than 2,000 dives. You're an educator and you had your moments in life. Were you at any point driven by this ambition of making money, or first for your own self? And you can be as honest or as politically
Redeem it. Every young person at some point, unless you're born into a very wealthy family, I would imagine has a concern for demonstrating one's competence, one's proficiency, one's ability. And, I grew up a white male in New England in the United States in a post-war era in a town that had a good educational system, and it was naturally competitive. I grew up in a family with 5 kids. It was naturally competitive. There was always this wanting to perform. And then when I got into the professional speaking field, it's a very lonely profession because it's you with a microphone. You have an audience, so it's social, but it's not like you go to work with a team every day.
Yeah.
And within that industry, there's also a sense of, ranking and achievement and writing bestsellers and getting standing ovations and basically being asked to be the speaker because it's a competitive space. So the answer to your question, was that ever a concern? Of course. I'm very fortunate that the success of the work that I've brought into the world and the teams that I've had the privilege and still do of working with has taken care of that as a concern. I mean, it's still a concern, of course, because I intend to live for decades and maybe not be. Yeah. Have you ever seen the movie with Al Pacino called Scent of a Woman?
Yeah, I have.
It's the only movie for which he won an Academy Award. And there's that wonderful scene when he goes, "I'm just getting warmed up." And that's how I feel. Okay. But now, given the platform of identity, of celebrity, if you will, of public recognition of the quality and the effectiveness of what it is that I've been able to work with other people to make happen in the world, then the question is, what's next?
Yes.
And that's not about making more money. Money's important. It works. It's useful. It's helpful. It's a currency of life. But the bigger question of what's next has to do with a contribution to the domain of concern called service and care for one another.
That's a very powerful thought, Ron. Ron, it's very difficult for me to summarize the nuggets of learnings that you have left me with. But I think the points which I'm definitely going to dwell on is the quote that you mentioned, that a life well lived contributes to the well-being of others. This entire distinction that you gave of creativity, invention, and innovation, because I had some muddled up thoughts about it. I'll have to dwell more on the historical reconstruction of field, but it's like afterthought, food for thought that happened in the dynamic moment.
Yes.
And what I tremendously enjoy, Ron, while talking to you is you have this side to you which is filled with levity, humor, entertainment. And amidst all of that, you bring terms and anecdotes of anthological reconstruction. The important question is not what is human being, but what is being human. And that really talks about the depth at which you think about your work and your life. And I especially loved the humility with which you accepted and narrated the anecdote of Singapore Airlines. So Thank you so much, Ron, for making time for this conversation and taking away a lot from this conversation. And I'm sure our viewers will too.